So great to be here. Actually, I know one of your people. They've moved to San Francisco, so Keith Geckler says hi. You may not recognize him. He now has long hair, ponytail, and wears bright colored clothing. So we have successfully hippified him in San Francisco. I am a co-pastor at St. John's Presbyterian Church. I've been there for 15 years. I was as an associate and then been 5 years as co-pastor. And when I started at St. John's did what many churches do when they're looking for a new pastor. They do that mission study. And they look at the demographics and they kind of see who's in the area. And St. John's discovered that there was a growing number of Chinese American families. So they got this great, brilliant idea that if they hire an Asian pastor, they will come. This is no different than, let's say, you want to bring in more young families into your church. So you hire that young pastor with 2.5 kids and a dog, and thinking the young families will come as well. Well, no Chinese American families came to St. John's because of my presence. And so what ended up happening was we started all over and we looked at really what is St. John's called to do in that neighborhood on Lake and Arguello. Well, God does have a sense of humor, and I got pregnant my first year. So not only am I the first woman pastor in the 140 so years of St. John's existence, but I'm pregnant. And therefore I told them I'm literally embodying their mission study and birthing the members myself, since I can't bring them in. Well, I also gave birth to a child who, let's just say, needed more months in the womb than the 9 months. I had him strapped to my body for the first 2 years of his life. My husband was also a pastor, and my son hated him. And so he would not even go to his own father, let alone the church nursery. And so this church that hired their first woman pastor now has somebody who's preaching with a baby strapped to their body. And there's something about preaching, and you're also rocking your baby back and forth. And eventually, the congregation starts swaying with you. Well, needless to say, I then was a pastor and a mother. And I couldn't just take off my pastor hat, and I couldn't just take off my mother hat. And so naturally, there were just changes that needed to be made within our congregation just so that I could be there. I needed to have my stroller within a hand's reach. I needed to be able to have juice and goldfish crackers to throw at my child so that he would just shut up. I needed them to have tolerance and grace for me to be able to mother and pastor at the same time. And that started then our journey to become an intergenerational church. So we're going to do, within the short, limited time, it's hard to kind of cram 15 years of work into less than an hour. So I'm going to just do 2 things. I really want to define what intergenerational is, and then maybe give you a possible process to begin that journey, or help you along that journey if you're already in it. What I'm not going to do is hopefully go to the next slide. There we go. What I'm not going to talk about is some concrete examples of things that you can do. And the reason why I'm not going to do that is because having Michael's or Hobby Lobby or any craft store vomit in your sanctuary, or having a designated kids area, or having coloring sheets, these are not things that will give a magic solution for your church to all of a sudden become intergenerational. It's much more intentional than that. It's much more strategic than that, and it's much more deliberate. But if you want those concrete examples, they exist out in the internet. One of the resources is a book called Intergenerational. This just came out in June. And this is a book that kind of talks about all the people who are getting PhDs in intergenerational ministry have come together to write this book. It's the same people that are putting on the Intergenerate conference, and there's one that's coming up in May in Nashville. I'll be speaking at this conference as well. So if you want to be networking with people who are in the midst of doing it, you can come to this conference. I put a bunch of just prayer station ideas and stuff on my blog. There's also Flame Creative Children's Ministry. They do a bunch of ways to interact with storytelling, biblical storytelling. There's Worshiping with Children that does some liturgical stuff. And then you all probably have heard of Messy Church, and that's if you want to completely design a church solely about interacting with intergenerations. So there's stuff out there. But the reason why I'm not going to focus too much on this kind of stuff is because intergenerational church means that you're not just changing things or what you're doing, you're changing people. And we all know it is hard to change people. It takes time to change people. It takes Jesus to change people. And so this stuff, while it is helpful to get you there, it is not the be-all and the end product of intergenerational ministry. So what is intergenerational? Well, let's first talk about what it is not. Intergenerational is not kid-friendly, meaning it's not about just young kids and making things dumbed down so that kids can understand it. It's more than that. It's really about intentionally figuring out how all generations and all ages can interact with one another, can truly learn from one another. It is intentional in the sense that it is not about isolating age groups, but it is about together where the kids learn from the adults and the adults learn from the kids, and all ages in between are mutually learning from one another. It also doesn't mean the same thing as multi-generational. Intergenerational and multi-generational are two different things. Multi-generational really just means that you have people of all ages that are just in existence with one another. And there's a sense of tolerance for one another. But you may have separate programming, you may have separate designated things going on for age appropriateness, and that makes it multi-generational. But there isn't a necessary crossing of learning or co-learning that needs to take place. And that goes the same with the term cross-generational as well. Cross-generational, there may be some learning, but really there isn't any place of transformation. Intergenerational means that there is interaction. There is an entwining, an intentional entwining of the generations. There means that there are people on both sides having to give up something. There's a sense of discomfort in that because you are mutually learning something. There's a reciprocity in that, and there's an equality in the learning. And so some things to keep in mind when you're looking at intergenerational church. It really is a one-room schoolhouse. Do you remember Little House on the Prairie? Of ages in one classroom, learning from one another. And what you have is the younger kids watching and are exposed to what the older kids are learning. And then you have the older kids who have opportunities to teach the younger kids. And so when you have this one-room schoolhouse, what you have happening is generations mutually serving, sharing, and learning from each other. That we don't assume that because kids are of that age, that they have nothing to teach the adults. And we don't assume, too, that because adults are supposed to be wiser and older, that they know all to even teach our younger kids. But there's a mutuality that is happening. I remember this one time I was baptizing a 3-year-old. And as I was baptizing 3-year-old, and I'm touching his head 3 times, I baptize you in the name of God, in the name of Jesus Christ, he insisted that he also baptize himself. So after I had baptized him, he was almost like, Pastor, I've been watching you do this many times, I've got this. And proceeded to also baptize himself. There's something about all generations being in worship together that children learn and watch their parents on how to pray, how to sing, how to be in community with one another. And I think as adults too, we learn that what it's like to worship with people that don't always act and behave and learn like us. So there's this mutuality going on. It also respects those that learn audibly, visually, and tactily. That as adults and as children, we all take in information differently. And I swear, as Presbyterians, we love our words. We love a well-crafted prayer. But this challenges us to think about other ways that we can worship God, experience God, and learn from one another. It also reminds us adults that really the only requirement for church is to just come as we are. Nothing more, nothing less. To keep asking questions and to remain curious. And it reminds the younger ones that really life can be hard. And especially in this day and age when we see so much happening on in the life around us and it is so close to the impact of our lives, I think younger ones need us to be around them and say, we've been through hard times too, and guess what? God is still faithful. Intergenerational church is a sanctuary. And what I mean by that is that it is a permissive place for all people to worship just as they are. You don't have to dress a certain way. You don't have to act a certain way. You don't have to behave a certain way. This place, this sanctuary, should be permission-giving so that no matter how God has created you, you can worship just as you are. There's no expectation to worship in any particular way. And you can think about that in just the ways that you lead worship. For example, when we stand to sing a hymn, and I think a lot of times we put in notes that say, stand if you are able. But what if you just said, stand if you feel like it? There's things that are beyond just the physical ability that keep us from wanting to stand. There may be other heavier emotional things that are weighing us down that sometimes all I can do is just be here in the present and hear the community sing for me. And can I have permission to do that? So think of ways of how to make worship permissible so that no matter how we come to this place, we can worship God. It pushes and challenges us to be aware of how all experience God's presence in worship, that we all experience God's presence differently, that the doxology that speaks so clear to you may not have the same effect on another person. And so being able to be aware of that. It also encompasses the full diversity spectrum of the congregation, that not only young, old, and everything in between, but really those who are new to the faith and those who grew up in the church. I have a 3rd grader who knows more about the Bible than some of our adults. That when I preach, and I cannot assume and say, you all know the story of Noah and the ark. Because I will have adults who say, never heard of that story, because they are so new to the faith. I had a conversation with my kids at the dinner table once, where I was just asking them what they learned in Sunday school. And it was a proud moment. I said, what did you guys learn in Sunday school? And my son said, oh, it was about Jonas and his 12 brothers. And my daughter said, it's not Jonas Brothers. It was Jesus and his 12 brothers. And then my son goes, well, whatever. Anyways, Jesus had 12 brothers, and apparently Jesus got a rainbow coat. And then I said, do you mean Joseph? And this was my proud moment because not only are my kids pastors' kids, but they are double pastors' kids, which just proves that I need to relook at our Sunday school curriculum. But it just shows that somehow, our youth and our children are somehow hearing the stories. They may not get all the names right, but we can't assume that just because of age that there's a certain knowledge of the Bible. So really, the sanctuary is accepting the full diversity of those who are new to faith, those who are new in age, those who are old in faith, and those who are older in age as well. It also mirrors the complex, diverse, and beautiful image of God and God's creation. That you would hope that as adults and as children, as we look around the room and around the diversity, that we get a broader perspective of who God is, that our vocabulary of how to name God expands as well. And I'm going to talk more about that part later on in the talk. Also, Intergenerational Church is a laboratory. And so within this space, this should be a place where we can practice how to exercise grace, forgiveness, and love to those that we deem different than ourselves. One of the things I love about Intergenerational Church is a concrete way to practice grace and forgiveness. That when you see a kid throwing a tantrum in the middle of worship, when you see something spill in the beautiful sanctuary, this concrete way and opportunity to practice what is sacred and what is holy and what is grace and what is forgiveness and how to expand kind of that permissive love to the parents and the family. Because let me tell you, it is the parents who are the most sensitive about how their kids are acting and not acting. And so this is a laboratory that if we can practice grace and forgiveness and unconditional love in this space, how much more are we able to then do it when we're outside our doors? It also opens us to the spontaneity of the Holy Spirit. When you have people of all ages in worship, there are going to be moments that are unplanned for, that are not written in the bulletin, that are completely unscripted. I had one moment when my 2-year-old daughter, she was quite the Houdini, and she escaped from the nursery. And I was about to do communion. And before I knew it, the communion bread was missing. My 2-year-old daughter had escaped, and she was under the communion table with the communion bread. And as I'm doing the words of institution, I'm playing tug-of-war with her under the communion table. And I have a picture of my daughter sitting on the chancel steps as I managed to break off a corner of the bread, and she is sitting there pleased with herself that she got a piece of this bread. But it gives you a moment to improv, to just think in the moment that everything doesn't have to be perfect and planned, that there are moments that give you an opportunity to speak God's truth, to show a different side of God, to speak and share a story of God in a different way. It also is creating a culture of change within the congregation. That change happens so much in our lives that this place as a laboratory could be a place where we can practice how to create that culture of change within our congregation. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. So how can here be a place of experimentation? So when we do some changes in our intergenerational church, why is change then so hard? Why is there no cookie cutter method? Why is there no foolproof method? And the reason is because it just is. Change is just difficult. For one, leaders and pastors, we were never taught how to lead change in our congregation. There was never a seminary class about change. But also, there's something about where in our daily lives, we experience change all the time, that people lose health and are healed, that we get new jobs and lose jobs, we change schools. Things are happening in our lives all the time. But when we walk into these doors of the church, we expect nothing to change. Even our smartphones, we update them all the time to the newest software. But for some reason in this church, in these walls, we expect nothing to change. And that's really hard. This is a picture, when I think about change, I always think about this picture. This is when Sweden switched from driving on the left side of the road to the right side of the road in 1967. And this was the first day. So that whenever you do introduce change in the congregation, you're going to have to expect some level of chaos and some level of confusion. No one's ever going to be happy about it. So quickly, where do we start? Where's the process? Here's some helpful tips to think about. Just some things about if you've ever done some adaptive change language or research or work, some things to keep in mind, because Intergenerational Church is an adaptive challenge. Adaptive change is a series of very small changes. So we're not talking about the next day, if this church wants to become intergenerational, you're going to rip out all of these pews, and then we're all going to play on the floor. That's not an adaptive change. It's really looking at what is a 1-degree change that you can make. And that when you're managing change, you're really managing loss. That people are losing something, or they're feeling like something is being lost. And so when you're changing something, just realize that there's a sense of grief going on. And so when people resist change, they're resisting loss. And then every time really someone says, well, how are you going to do that? How is this going to work? What's going to be the outcome? It's really them expressing some type of resistance. And so an important way then maybe to phrase that when people are saying how and what and why is to say, yes, I understand that this is happening, or that we're grieving this, or that this is scary, or that we're losing this, but nevertheless, let's just try this, because we can always go back. And then always know that failing is inevitable, that it's a part of the process, it's how we learn, and that change will take twice, if not thrice, as long as you expect it to be. So that's just some adaptive change language. So where do you start? Well, the process is always building an awareness and understanding, having an assessment and evaluation, and then experimenting. So before you even think about doing anything, the first thing is to build an awareness and an understanding. To get a flavor of, do people understand why there's a need to become intergenerational or any other change that you want to do? Michael Frost and Alan Hirsch, they do a lot of adaptive change work. They said that people must be convinced that there's a problem before they're interested in a solution. So one of the first things to do is really to create a listening space so that people can hear why this is important, but also hear from them of what maybe is important to them or what their fears are as well. So one of the ways to do this is what we did at St. John's, is to create what Patrick Lencioni calls a playbook. Patrick Lencioni says that we all have mission statements, but they really do a disservice to us because they don't give us concrete steps on how to live out that mission statement. So he says to ask these 6 questions instead. And so one is just to figure out, why do you exist? Why does St. John's Presbyterian Church exist? Knowing the why is the most important question before the what and the how. And then once you figure out why you exist, how does that shape and form the way that you behave? So we exist this way, and that informs why we behave this way. And then once you figure that out, then what do you do? Not literally concrete things of what do you do, but how does your church go about living out that existence? And he uses the word succeed. Another way to put this is, how do you know your incongruence with why you exist? So how do you know you're really living into the way that you're to exist as either St. John's or Covenant or Second Press or whatever? And then, once you have that, these last 2 questions are something that can always change. So what do we want to do right now? What's important to do right now? What's that low-hanging fruit, or what's the first step? And then, who's going to do what?
which is always important. We always figure out what we're going to do, and then we never designate who's going to actually do it. And so this is maybe in lieu of doing a mission statement or in conjunction with answering these 6 questions, if you brought your congregation to answer these or to explore these questions and creating a playbook, there's a sense of awareness and understanding that may come through that, and may come out of that. The next is assessment and evaluation. One of the things that is helpful for being co-pastors is that my pastor that I work with, we take turns every season preaching. So, for example, he has the season of Advent, I'm going to take the season of Epiphany, he'll take the season of Lent, and it gives us about 5 or 6 weeks to do other stuff. And one of the other things that I do is when he's preaching, I usually sit in the back just to watch and assess and evaluate how other people are entering or not entering into worship, and what changes could possibly be made, what are obstacles, or what are we doing well. I had a team go through answering these questions where they took a bulletin, and from the moment they walked into the doors to the moment that they left the doors during worship, they were to write notes of how do people worship, when do you notice them weaving in and out, who is entering into worship, what invites them, what are the obstacles, what do they notice are the sacred things. When I was moderator of San Francisco Presbytery, we would visit different churches for our Presbytery meetings, and for some reason I was a little masochistic. I would just move a candle to the left and see if anybody noticed. And you could always see then certain church members go, that candle is 2 inches to the left. So what's sacred in your congregation? What are those things that usually cannot be touched? What are potential opportunities for change? What surprised you in worship? What seemed challenging in worship? What could be done better and what works well? I think many times when we come into worship, we just focus on ourselves. And so to have people designated to answer these kind of questions and take notes and to observe and look around, you might notice some easy things that you can begin with to experiment and to begin to evaluate how really and truly you are welcoming to those that are of all ages. And lastly is to then finally begin experimenting with something. I put this book out there because it's kind of a fun book, but also a helpful tool to think about how to begin trying something, but also evaluating what you're experimenting with. I don't know if you know this book, but it's called 50 Dangerous Things You Should Let Your Children Do. And this comes from, Gevert Tully says we live in a time where we don't let our kids climb trees because we're afraid they're going to break their leg, and we don't let kids do what we used to do when we were kids, but because now they're very dangerous. So he names a few things that weren't dangerous when we were kids, but we now consider dangerous. So one of those things is licking a 9-volt battery. How many of you have licked a 9-volt battery? Right? And we're all alive. So this is one of the things that this is actually the number one thing he suggests kids to do. So I just want to give you a little bit of the instructions for this. So he says what's required is a 9-volt battery. And then the first step is to hold the battery in your hand with the terminals facing up. And then you're going to stick out your tongue. You're going to take a deep breath. And then you're going to think about kangaroos hopping around in a field of flowers. This is really just to heighten the anticipation. You can think about anything you want. And then quickly touch the metal terminals of the battery to your tongue. And then try again, but hold it there for a full second. And what's great about this book is it has the instructions on one side, and then it has this whole blank page. And this is field notes to list your observations and improvements and new ideas to make this experiment better. And this is really a great approach to thinking about what experiments you want to do at your church. To maybe think of, maybe 50 is too much. Maybe you want to think of 5 or 10 dangerous things that you want to experiment with. And then as you go along doing it, The important thing is to take field notes, observations, ways that you would do it better, ways that maybe you won't do it again. It was a nice try, it was a nice thought. But to always assess and evaluate as you go about experimenting. So you can experiment with space, moving and removing stuff, using the liturgical seasons to maybe be more creative in worship, or even just stop doing stuff. What would it be like to stop doing that one programming that everyone says they want in your church, but nobody shows up to it? Let's experiment with just not doing it anymore and see if anybody says anything. There was one point, it was about maybe the 7-year mark at my time at St. John's, and it was the Sunday before the Christmas Eve service, and I started to just move pews to make more space for something interactive that we were going to do. And the pews were pretty much set like this. And then I kept moving pews, and I kept moving pews to a point where I had moved them in a complete circle. And I don't recommend doing that, but it was in some ways a test for me to see how far we had come. We had been doing these 1-degree changes. And there are moments sometimes when you can do a 10-degree change just to test the waters to see how ready your congregation is for bigger changes. I just want to wrap up with putting it all together. This comes from Eric Law from his book, Inclusion. And what he does is he says that as you are beginning to assess and understand and evaluate and experiment, that you might want to claim with your congregation what is the fear zone and what is the safe zone. And between the fear zone and the safe zone is what he calls the grace margin. And that is really the margin where you are going to be examining and assessing and experimenting. It's really the reciprocal exchange of power. And this is really a tug of war, that sometimes your grace margin diminishes and sometimes it expands depending on how much people are fearful and how much people feel safe to go about experimenting that. One of the things that helps with a fear and safe zone is creating a covenant, something that you will promise to do but also gives you permission to try. One of the things in this book is that at the very first page there is a covenant that says, I, blank, will demonstrate that danger can be conquered with skill and determination. As proof of this, I will complete the challenges put forth in this book. Maybe not today, maybe not next week, and maybe not this year, but one day I will check off every one of these 50 dangerous things. So what would that be? What would that covenant be for you all as you experiment and as you create this grace margin? And the reason why this picture is important here is because intergenerational church is more than just worship. It's more than just creative worship. What ends up happening is you have to change the whole way your church functions. How you call leaders, how you do meetings. That if you want families, if you want younger people to join, you have to think about time. You have to think about the system. You have to think about, does the system help certain people in power versus other people in power? And that all children who are age 5 are not all alike, just like all adults at age 50 are not alike. And so there's a sense of intersectionality going on as well. So leadership, volunteer opportunities, meetings, how do those need to change in order for everything to be intergenerational? And then as you're doing that, how does worship need to change as well? Because worship often is the first point and the most impactful point of the church. And then how does, when you're doing these things, impact age, giving all senses an ability to participate? How's language, sense of inclusivity in the way that you use God language, in the sense of gender, in the way that you use God language, and gender representation? How do you look at race? That if you're wanting to be less of a monocultural church and a more multi or intercultural church, how do you invite other people of other different colors and ethnicities to participate in leadership and volunteer opportunities and meetings? And then ableism. One of the things that when we moved our pews to create more room for strollers is there ended up being more room for those who were using wheelchairs and walkers. So how do you also create that all of those who have different abilities to enter into all aspects of the church? And sexuality as well, that we had a kid in middle school begin to transition from a boy and a girl. And because we had already been doing so much of intentional intergenerational work, we were able to nurture her through this most important, vulnerable stage in her life in a way that was honoring not only how God created her, but also in a way that nurtured her faith. So how does church do that? And then class. And powers of money and those who give and those who aren't able to give monetarily. And also religion as well. I don't know down in Southern California, but certainly up in San Francisco, we are getting more and more interfaith families where we are right across the street from a synagogue, and so we have families who worship across the street at the synagogue, and then they will also worship at St. John's. I also have kids who have gone through confirmation where one parent is an atheist and the other parent is a member at St. John's. And so they're having to determine their faith on, do they even believe in God? And so how also do we talk about other ways of believing? And then education. That as Presbyterians, we value education, we value words, we value big words. But how do we also represent all levels of education as well? And then citizenship. Immigration has become a big part of our church. We just became a sanctuary church. And so to think about all the levels that people are coming and are vulnerable because of their immigration status as well. So those are some things to consider. We have about 30 seconds if you have any questions and answers, as I have verbally vomited basically 15 years of work of becoming an intergenerational church. But if there are any questions, I'll be glad to take some now.
And we're here till 3:15.
Oh, okay. Well, then good. We have 15 minutes to answer any questions. Yeah.
Many of our churches have moments for children or children's stories. And it's been well received by all generations, but I still feel uncomfortable with that because that's dismissing our kids early on in the worship service. Do you have some thoughts about what you do at St. John's?
So we don't have a moment for children. I don't have an opinion on whether you should have a moment for children. I just think whether you do or whether you don't, you just have to think it through really carefully. So one of the reasons why we started experimenting with not having a moment for children, the first one was our children actually were not receiving it very well. That oftentimes they would say something that they thought was very profound, but the congregation thought it was very cute. And so there was a burst of laughter. And they took it as something that they did that was wrong. So that was the impetus for us to look at why having a special moment for children and what was the point. There were two responses. One was adults seemed to understand more of what was going on in the children's sermon than what was going on in the sermon. So that was something to look at. The other part was if we were really going to switch our liturgy and the ways that we worship so that all are included, then was it necessary to have that moment for children? As far as segregating them out, I think being intergenerational does not always mean everyone has to do everything together. I think segregated moments are sometimes necessary and important. I grew up in Reno, so I'm all about options and the buffet. So I love to give people options. So when parents come in, especially if they're new to your church, and they're like, okay, what are you going to allow for my family to do? Well, some parents want their kids to worship with them, and they want to be able to know that they can do that. Some actually want their kids to go off. And so we have, it only takes half of worship, and we just have a moment where kids can go to the chapel to have like a Sunday lesson, but they come back for the latter half of worship. And then we have kids who choose to stay within worship as well. And so we give them options. But no matter what you choose to do or not do, it really goes down to awareness and understanding. Why are you doing it? For some churches, if it's meaningful for you, then keep it. Keep the moment for children.
Thank you.
Is this where I get into my K-pop dancing skills?
Can you give us another example or two of, well, you've done this work over 15 years, and you started out at one point, and now you're at this point. And so what were some of the major changes that you made to become an intergenerational church?
I think when we started out, one of the first things, we were so much at a starting point of children should be seen and not heard. So the amount of space that we had that was permissive was about this big. And so our first adaptive challenge was how to expand that space so that we could have more space to just experiment and play with. That's where some of the tools helps. Sometimes you do want to kind of shake up the congregation a little bit by moving things in the sanctuary or by creating a designated space for kids to start that out. So I would say in my first 7 or so years, if you visited St. John's, it very much looked like a Michael's craft store. Because we needed to use a lot of tools to kind of be very visually obvious that we are being intentional. Over time, like if you were to visit us now, it seems less like we are being intentional about being intergenerational. The reason why is because it's already there in the attitude. That the kids, and no matter what age a person is, and whether they're new to the church or not to the church, when they step in, they already sense that the permissive space is there. And so we feel less of a need to kind of intentionally do some of the stuff that we used to do before. But just like I said, one day I moved pews around. Other days it had to do with bringing in more intergenerational singing. Some of the things, so providing options, making a covenant, considering provided segregated times, planning rituals and prayers to be interactive. Actually, when we started this, a good year went by when no one went to a prayer station. So we would have like 12 minutes of, you're now able to wander around the sanctuary to interact in any of these prayer stations. And everyone just sat in the pews. We try to look at different ways. We have a very historic organ, and so wanting to make ways for singing to be a teachable moment, and ways for even old hymns and the organ to be accessible to all ages. I had to evaluate my own sermon and preaching style. And I also like providing different entry points into worship for all ages, knowing that for some people they'll enter in and this is meaningful for them, and for others this may not, but there's permission space to go, okay, but this might be meaningful for somebody else. And later on, there's going to be a moment for me to enter back in to worship and find something meaningful. So, yeah.
What is the goal to become an intergenerational church?
I think the goal is...
That will be better than local church.
Well, I think the goal is that if you look at the Presbyterian denomination, the world is, we know the world is changing. The nation's becoming more diverse. We see that in the people around us. And yet our churches are still mostly white and they're aging. So where's the chasm? Where's the gap in that? And so I think for really us to look at ways our church can be reflective of our neighborhood and our community, we have to look at what are we holding on to and why. That it's not easy, it's very difficult, but there is a great benefit to becoming a more diverse congregation. But it means that the people in the congregation have to give up something. And that's often, I think, the first challenge an obstacle that we find. That we often want young families to come to our church, but what we're asking them is to act like us, to be like us, grow our membership, and grow our budget. But it really has to be the other way around. And sometimes what we do is we define that as, well, this is how the church is. The church culture should not change, because this is how it's supposed to be. We should not be giving in to the bigger culture. But then, I'll kind of address this in my sermon later on, I would challenge that the church has a culture. That really it is about the people and our neighbors. And if our neighbors are changing, then the church needs to change as well. That's the goal. The goal is really living out the greatest commandment. Love your neighbor as yourself. Love God with all your heart, soul, and mind. And in some ways that is becoming an intergenerational church. In some ways it's just becoming a more diverse church. That's why I'm saying an intergenerational church is maybe the first step. What my warning is it doesn't stop there, because we're all different. You need to make them room for other differences that are going to happen, because all kids are not the same and all adults are not the same. That we are made up of different cultures and different backgrounds and different faith. We all come with different church baggage and different church wonderful stories. And so how do we allow those stories to intersect in a way that challenges us? We learn from that, and we also share in that as well. I think that's just being church. That's the goal.
So change equals loss, and that's what people resist. I'm just curious to know what the biggest loss was for your church and what you saw in terms of resistance.
It's a good question, because what is the loss that was really going on, and then what was the loss that was being manifested? So a story would be that when we got rid of our 100-year-old pews. So you could say the loss was the 100-year-old pews. I can't tell you how many emails that I got that were in all caps, which means that they're yelling at me. But really, when you get down to it, it could be anything from just anything simple from, this is just not the way I remember this church to be. And I just don't like it. To a sense of what is church, what is sacred and what is holy. To me, what is sacred and what is holy is preserving, we have these historic stained glass windows, preserving the historicity of these 100-year-old pews, preserving the carpet by not allowing coffee and juice in the sanctuary, that children should be still and quiet, and that's respectful, because worship is respectful. It's particular to any person, but the way it manifests itself sometimes could be, don't change these pews. One of the great stories, and when we were changing these pews, what happened was, one is we first talked about the DNA and what we found to be the core of St. John's. One is, in the 147 years of history at St. John's, the location that we're at right now was the third location in its history. And that we have a history of making necessary changes. Not just changing pews, but changing location, changing buildings. And one of the first pastors says, this is a congregation that is meant to live into being daring and confident. Also, in digging into the history, we found out that we used to have this huge stone baptismal font that one of the pastors had gotten rid of. that this congregation doesn't even remember. And then we tracked down where this baptismal font is, and it is a bird bath at the San Francisco Theological Seminary. Our sacred stone baptismal font. So when we started changing out these pews, someone went into a coffee shop, and they saw a coffee shop had purchased a bunch of our pews. And it became a story that these pews had sat in this congregation for 100 years, listening to our stories and our prayers. And now it is out in the world, listening to the stories of people sitting in those chairs, drinking coffee with their friends and their families. Are we not supposed to be doing the same thing? And so you're managing loss. The point is, how do you get from there to then being transformed in the way that you think, in the way that you believe, in the way that you worship, to a point where you didn't realize what was possible. Audience? Well, thank you for your time and thank you for